In a concrete control bunker hundreds of miles from the pipeline itself, a technician named Viktor Morozov stared at his console. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and hot electronics. It was June 1982. Outside, the brief pale light of the Siberian summer was fading. Inside, the green screen characters on his display were no longer making sense. It began subtly. A pressure sensor deep in the remote wilderness reported a figure that was illogical. A transient spike, quickly dismissed as a sensor glitch. The automated systems, designed by the brilliant minds at the Ministry of Gas Industry, were programmed to handle such anomalies. They would isolate, compensate, and report. But then, a second sensor reported an impossibility, and a third. Morozov watched, his blood cooling, as the data cascade began. A pump station reported its status as online and offline simultaneously. A critical valve, number 83B, registered a pressure of 500 atmospheres. Then 800. The console blinked a calm, steady green, insisting the valve was functioning perfectly within safe parameters, even as the numerical readout screamed that it was moments from catastrophic failure. The steel of the pipeline wasn't rated for half that. He reached for the manual override. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the shutdown commands. The system ignored him. He tried again. Access denied. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. This wasn't a glitch. A glitch was a frozen screen, a nonsensical string of characters. This was different. The system was lying to him. It was actively, intelligently resisting his control, reporting a tranquil, all-normal status, while the physics of the situation hurtled toward disaster. The chief engineer, a heavy-set man named Borin, was shouting into a telephone, his voice tight with panic. He slammed the receiver down. "The field crews can't get a signal," he growled. "The entire section is dark." Victor looked at the main pressure graph. The line, which should have been a gentle rolling wave, had become a vertical spike. It had breached 1,000 atmospheres. It was no longer a reading. It was a countdown. "It's gonna go," Victor whispered. Borin grabbed the console, shaking it uselessly. "Shut it down. Shut it down." "I can't," Victor said, his hands raised from the keyboard in surrender. "It won't let me." Miles away, in the desolate heart of the taiga, the ground swelled. The pressure inside the massive 48-inch steel pipe exceeded the tensile strength of its welds. The earth ripped open. With a deafening low-frequency roar, millions of cubic meters of natural gas vented into the atmosphere in a single catastrophic instant. The friction and the force of the escaping gas ignited the plume. The result was not an explosion in the conventional sense, it was a fuel-air detonation of biblical proportions. A column of fire thousands of feet high turned the Siberian night into day. The heat bloom was so intense, so vast, that American infrared satellites in geosynchronous orbit immediately registered it. At NORAD, deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, analysts scrambled, their blood running cold. They logged the event as a possible tactical nuclear detonation. But there was no missile launch, no radioactive signature, just a flash, a fireball that dwarfed Hiroshima, erupting from the middle of nowhere. Back in the control room, the screens went black. One by one they blinked out, replaced by a single, mocking phrase: "System error." No data. The phones were dead. The radios were static. The silence that returned was no longer the peaceful quiet of the forest. It was the thick, suffocating silence of the void. The news hit the Kremlin like a physical blow. The first reports were fragmentary, confused. An accident, a fire. But the scale of the fire was the problem. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, was the first to grasp the implications. Their satellite reconnaissance, once the film was processed, showed a scorched crater miles wide. The pipeline, the artery, was severed. The KGB was scrambled immediately. Within hours, investigators from the first Chief Directorate, PGU, and the second Chief Directorate, Internal Security, were on military transports heading east. This could not be an accident. An industrial failure of this magnitude was impossible. The systems were triple redundant. The engineering was the pride of the nation. This had to be sabotage. This was the great fear. That the Americans, through their Central Intelligence Agency, had finally found a way to strike directly at the Soviet homeland, to attack their economic center of gravity without triggering a nuclear war. The investigators descended on the blast site, their faces wrapped in scarves against the acrid smoke. They waded through a landscape of blackened trees and twisted, molten steel. They were looking for the telltale signs of an explosive charge, for the chemical residue of Semtex or C4. They were looking for timers, for detonator wires, for anything that pointed to a human hand. They found nothing. There was no bomb crater, just a massive, shallow bowl where the earth had been vaporized. The pipe had not been breached from the outside in. It had been torn apart from the inside out. The evidence was irrefutable. The pipeline had destroyed itself. This was the moment the confusion truly set in. This was the birth of the mystery. The investigators turned their attention to the control room. They seized the logs. They interrogated Viktor Morozov and the engineering staff. The men, pale and shaken, could only repeat their story. The system went mad. It lied. It fought them. The KGB officers, men who had spent their lives hunting spies and traitors, were stumped. They understood bombs. They understood traitors. They did not understand a ghost in the machine. They impounded the magnetic data tapes, the punch cards, and the hardware logs from the control center. They flew them to a special computer laboratory in Moscow, a high-security facility run by Directorate T, the KGB's science and technology branch. The analysts at Directorate T fed the tapes into their own diagnostic machines. The code was perfect. The programming, most of it based on Western designs painstakingly acquired by Directorate T's agents abroad, was flawless. On the surface, but when they ran the simulations, the same impossible anomalies appeared. The software itself, the complex algorithms designed to prevent failure, had commanded the failure. The immediate reaction was terror. If the pipeline's control system was compromised, what else was? The entire Soviet industrial base, from tractor factories to chemical plants, was being modernized with the same new computer technology. The national power grid, the air defense network, the secure communication lines to their nuclear submarine fleet, all of it was being automated, all of it run by code. The stakes were suddenly clear. This was not about a single pipeline. This was not about lost revenue. This was about the total, systemic vulnerability of the Soviet Union. An unknown, unseen enemy had found a way to turn their own technology against them. The ghost in the machine was not a technical glitch. It was a weapon. A weapon they could not see, could not find, and could not fight. The hunt was on, but the KGB was looking for a phantom. They were searching for a saboteur who had never set foot in Siberia, for a bomb that was never planted. They were hunting for an enemy that was already inside their most secure systems, a digital cancer that was quietly metastasizing, waiting for the command to strike again. The pipeline was just the opening shot. The real war, they feared, was just beginning. CTA. If you want to understand how the invisible battles of the Cold War shaped our modern world, you're in the right place. This is Cold War Impact. Subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of this story and our other investigations into the shadows of the 20th century. The pipeline disaster of 1982 was the impossible event, the mystery that defied explanation. But for the men in the KGB, it was not an isolated incident. It was the terrifying culmination of a pattern they were only beginning to see. For the past several years, the entire technological infrastructure of the Soviet Union had been quietly, inexplicably rotting from within. Factory managers in the Ural Mountains reported that brand new, computer-controlled milling machines, the pride of their modernized plants, were producing components that were just slightly out of tolerance, not enough to be obvious, but enough to cause catastrophic failures down the line. Turbine blades for jet engines developed micro-fractures. Ball bearings for tanks wore out in weeks, not years. The machines insisted they were operating correctly, but the physical reality of their output was undeniable. It was junk. In the Soviet Far East, the air defense network, the PVO, was experiencing phantom tracks. Radar operators would see an intruder, a blip moving at impossible speeds, faster than any known aircraft. They would scramble their best interceptors, the new MiG-25 Foxbats, burning precious fuel and pilot hours to chase ghosts. The moment the jets approached, the targets would vanish from the screens. The pilots saw nothing but empty sky. It was a massive, costly, and humiliating drain on their military readiness. Even the Ministry of Agriculture was failing. New, sophisticated tractors and combines, equipped with the latest microprocessors, were breaking down in the fields. Their complex electronics, supposedly designed for reliability, were frying in the summer heat or the winter cold. The harvest rotted while mechanics waited for replacement parts that were just as faulty as the ones they were replacing. The Soviet system was built on a foundation of 5-year plans, of quotas and statistics, and the statistics were now lying. The reports claimed record production, revolutionary modernization. The reality was a nation grinding to a halt, choked by its own advanced technology. This was the true terror for the KGB. The pipeline was a single massive explosion. But these other failures were subtle, insidious, and everywhere. It was a quiet, creeping sickness. They launched a dozen high-level investigations. They blamed drunkenness on the factory floor. They blamed poor quality control. They blamed lazy engineers. They arrested managers and sent them to labor camps. But the failures continued. The problem, they concluded, must be the technology itself. The new wave of semiconductors, microchips, and computer systems, the very tools they believed would let them finally catch up to the West, was defective. But why? The answer was simple and humiliating. The Soviet Union didn't invent most of this technology, it stole it. Directorate T of the KGB, in cooperation with the GRU, ran a global multi-billion-dollar espionage operation codenamed Line X. Its sole purpose was to acquire, by any means necessary, the West's most advanced scientific and industrial secrets. They stole blueprints for computers, designs for software, and samples of integrated circuits. They then reverse-engineered this stolen tech and plugged it directly into their own military-industrial complex. This had always been the way. It was how they built their first atomic bomb. It was how they built their computers. But now, it seemed, the pipeline of stolen goods was delivering poison. The investigators were trapped. They were confronting a mystery that was, by its very nature, unsolvable from their perspective. They were looking for a physical enemy, a human traitor, a tangible piece of evidence. But the enemy wasn't a person. The enemy was an idea. The enemy was in the code. The enemy was in the very blueprints they had fought so hard to steal. The Soviet Union was being undermined, not by what the West was denying them, but by what the West was allowing them to take. The Kremlin was a fortress of paranoia. In the wake of the Siberian pipeline disaster, an event so massive it was now simply called the incident, the highest echelons of the Soviet state were in turmoil. The Politburo convened in an emergency session, the air in the gilded hall thick with uncharacteristic fear. These were men who had stared down the American nuclear arsenal, but this was different. This was an invisible, internal rot. Mikhail Suslov, the party's aged, grim-faced chief ideologue, framed the problem in stark, terrifying terms. "Comrades," his reedy voice cut through the smoke, "we are facing a new kind of war, a war of ghosts and shadows. The Americans are not attacking our tanks. They are attacking our factories. They are not bombing our cities. They are bombing our data." The response was immediate and overwhelming. A special state commission was formed, a troika, with unprecedented power, led by a ruthless KGB deputy chairman, a humorless GRU general, and a panicked minister from the industrial sector. Their mandate was simple: find the source of the technological plague and excise it, no matter the cost. The Soviet scramble began. It was a massive, clumsy, and brutal investigation that tore through the scientific and industrial heart of the nation. The Commission's first act was to treat the symptom, not the disease. They launched a vast, internal purge. This was a threat, and threats were met by the Chekists' boot. Investigators from the Second Chief Directorate descended upon the Ministry of Gas Industry, upon the research institutes in Novosibirsk, and upon the military design bureaus in Moscow. They operated on the only logic they knew: treason. This catastrophic failure must be the work of human hands, of wreckers and spies paid in American dollars. Engineers who had worked on the pipeline control software were arrested in the dead of night. Viktor Morozov, the technician who had helplessly watched the console as Siberia exploded, was subjected to weeks of relentless interrogation. They shouted at him, "Who gave you the codes? How did you communicate with your CIA handler? What was the signal?" Morozov, and hundreds like him, could only repeat the truth. The system did it itself. The code was wrong. It lied to us. This answer was unacceptable. It was technologically illiterate. It was insane. To the investigators, it was a poorly constructed lie. A machine could not lie. A machine did what it was told. Therefore, someone must have told it to fail. The purge widened. Factory managers, low-level programmers, and quality control inspectors were arrested, accused of economic sabotage. The gulags, never empty, saw a new influx of technical prisoners. But the purge found no spy ring. It found no CIA handler. It found only terrified, confused men. And the failures continued. Simultaneously, the Commission turned its cold eye on Directorate T, the KGB's own vaunted Line X acquisition division. The men who had been heroes yesterday, the dashing illegals who stole the West's secrets, were now suspects. Their acquisitions were quarantined. Every stolen microchip, every reel of magnetic tape, every photocopied blueprint was re-examined with paranoid scrutiny. Had their agents been doubled? Were they being fed this technology? A dreadful, circular logic took hold. To admit the stolen technology was the source of the poison was to admit that the entire Line X program, a cornerstone of Soviet technological progress for the past 2 decades, was a catastrophic failure. It was to admit that their best spies were either traitors or fools. This admission was institutionally impossible. The Commission's report, therefore, concluded the opposite. The principles of the stolen technology were sound, but they were being implemented incorrectly by domestic saboteurs. The purge continued, solving nothing. While the investigators hunted for human traitors, the bogeyman itself was growing stronger, embedding itself deep in the psyche of the Soviet military. The most terrifying front in this invisible war was not in the factories, but in the skies over the motherland. This is where the mystery became a legend. The PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, was the largest, most sophisticated air defense network ever built. It was a continent-spanning web of thousands of radar sites, surface-to-air missile batteries, and interceptor squadrons, all designed for one purpose: to repel an American nuclear strike. And in the early 1980s, it began to see ghosts. Major Ivan Belenko, a pilot in a high-readiness MiG-25 squadron near Murmansk, lived this legend. The MiG-25 Foxbat was the pinnacle of Soviet engineering, a monstrous stainless steel interceptor built to fly at 3 times the speed of sound and reach the very edge of space. It was designed specifically to hunt and kill the one American aircraft that terrified them, the SR-70, one Blackbird. The alert siren would scream at 3 a.m. Belenko would be sprinting across the frozen tarmac, the icy air searing his lungs. 20 minutes later, he would be at 80,000 feet, his cockpit a lonely bubble of light against a black, star-drenched sky, the curvature of the Earth clearly visible below. His ground control intercept, GCI officer, would be vectoring him in, his voice a tense crackle in Belenko's helmet. Target is bearing 030, range 100 kilometers, Angels 90, speed Mach 4.5. Belenko's blood would freeze. Mach 4.5, 90,000 feet. There was no such aircraft. Not even the Americans had that. "Confirm speed," he would radio back, his own voice tight. "Confirmed, 4.5, intercept, arm your missiles." Belenko would push his throttles forward, his Tumansky engines gulping fuel in massive, inefficient torrents. He would line up for the attack, his own radar sweeping the empty blackness ahead, and he would see nothing. "No contact," he would report. "Radar is clear." "Impossible," the GCI would shout. "My screen is lit, it's right in front of you. Fire, fire!" Belenko would stare into the void. There was no heat bloom, no exhaust trail, no radar return. Just the calm, steady readouts of his own systems, telling him he was alone. And then, the GCI's voice would drop, laced with a familiar, weary panic. "The target! It's gone! It just vanished from the screen." This happened not once, but dozens of times. All along the Arctic Circle, from the Kola Peninsula to the Bering Strait, PVO operators watched their screens light up with impossible targets. These phantoms would fly in erratic, high-speed patterns, triggering the entire defense network. Squadrons would scramble. Missile batteries would go on high alert. The system would burn through millions of rubles in fuel and resources, tracking ghosts. The effect was devastating. It was more than a waste of resources. It was a psychological weapon. The pilots and radar operators, the frontline defenders of the nation, began to distrust their own equipment. They began to doubt their own eyes. Was the radar lying? Was ground control hallucinating? Or was there really something out there? An American ghost plane, so advanced that it could appear and disappear at will. The paranoia was crippling, helplessness set in. The PVO was the shield of the nation, and the shield was full of holes. But the holes weren't physical, they were in the data. The bogeyman wasn't an aircraft. It was in the circuits of the radar stations, in the software of the command and control computers. But the Soviets, lacking the concept of a logic bomb or a Trojan horse in their software, had no framework to understand this. They were fighting a digital enemy with analog tactics. The Kremlin Commission, faced with a failing purge and a military terrified of phantoms, was forced to draw conclusions. Their investigation had to produce an enemy, and if they couldn't find the real enemy, they would have to invent one. The theories they developed became the new, secret orthodoxy. They were all wrong, and they all pushed the Soviet Union further down a path of self-destruction. The first and most dominant theory was that of a new, undetectable American weapon. The pipeline explosion, they reasoned, was not caused by a software glitch. It was caused by an external energy pulse. They hypothesized that the Americans had deployed a new type of reconnaissance aircraft, or perhaps a satellite, that could beam a high-energy microwave pulse or a particle beam to overload and destroy electronic systems on the ground. This theory neatly explained everything. It explained the ghost radar tracks. Those weren't phantoms, they were the weapon itself, maneuvering at impossible speeds. It explained the pipeline disaster. The weapon had zapped the control systems. It explained the failing microchips in their factories. They were being slowly cooked by this invisible energy field. This conclusion was horrifying, but it was also a relief. It meant their own technology wasn't flawed. It was simply being attacked. The response was predictable. They poured billions of rubles they did not have into hardening their infrastructure. They demanded new shielding for their computers, new filters for their power grids. They launched a desperate crash program to develop their own particle beam weapon to counter the American one. They were, in effect, building a multi-billion ruble shield to fight an imaginary dragon. The second theory was a variation of the first. It wasn't a new aircraft, it was a new bomber. The Americans, they believed, had finally achieved the stealth aircraft they had been rumored to be working on since the 1970s. This was the F-19, a phantom plane whispered about in Western aviation magazines. They believed this aircraft could fly deep into Soviet territory, unseen, and drop tiny precision electronic warfare devices near key installations. These devices would then infect the systems. This theory led to a massive, costly re-engineering of their entire air defense radar network. They tried to develop new low-frequency radars, new infrared search and track systems, anything that might catch a glimpse of these invisible attackers. The MiG-25, built to chase high, fast targets, was suddenly obsolete. They needed a new interceptor, one that could look down and find low, slow, stealthy planes. The effort to design this counter would drain the Soviet aviation industry for the rest of the decade. The investigation had failed. The hunt for answers had only produced deeper, more expensive questions. The KGB and the GRU, unable to find the simple, devastating truth, had created a complex, mythological enemy. They were now fighting their own shadows, spending their last resources to counter weapons that did not exist, all while the real enemy, the corrupted code, the poisoned blueprints, sat quietly on their shelves, labeled top secret, acquired by their very best spies. The cancer was in the body, and the doctors were treating the patient for a ghost. While the Kremlin's finest minds chased imaginary particle beams and hunted for non-existent stealth bombers, the real war was being managed from quiet, carpeted offices in Washington, D.C. The mystery that was bleeding the Soviet Union dry was not a new ghost plane or a death ray. It was a stack of paper. The story of the Soviet technological collapse begins not with a weapon, but with a betrayal. It begins with a man. His name was Vladimir Ippolitovich Vetrov, a 3-year-old engineer working deep inside the belly of the beast, Directorate T of the KGB, the very organization tasked with the Line X program to steal the West's technology. Vetrov was not a high-flying ideologue. He was a disgruntled, passed-over bureaucrat who had grown to despise the corruption and incompetence of the system he served. Codenamed Farewell by the French intelligence service, the DST, he was, for a time, the most important spy in the world. Beginning in 1981, Vetrov began handing over the crown jewels. In a series of clandestine meetings in Moscow, he passed thousands of pages of top-secret documents to his French handlers. It was not battlefield intelligence. It was something far more valuable. It was the complete, unvarnished, multi-year shopping list of the Soviet military-industrial complex. The farewell dossier, as it came to be known, contained the meticulous details of every piece of technology the Soviets were trying to steal, from microchips and computer software to chemical processes and missile guidance systems. It detailed what they had already acquired, what they were currently targeting, and who their agents and front companies were in the West. In July 1981, at the Ottawa Economic Summit, French President François Mitterrand quietly pulled President Ronald Reagan aside. He informed the American president of this extraordinary intelligence source and offered to share the dossier. When the files landed on the desks of the CIA at Langley, the analysts were stunned. It was the most massive and comprehensive intelligence breach the Soviets had ever suffered. The immediate, reflexive instinct of the Pentagon was predictable. Stop them. Use the dossier to identify the spy rings, shut down the front companies, and tighten the net of export controls. Block Line X at every turn. But one man, a brilliant and unassuming White House technology advisor named Gus Weiss, saw something different. Weiss looked at the dossier not as a list of threats to be blocked, but as a list of opportunities to be exploited. The Soviets, he realized, were not just stealing technology, they were addicted to it. Their own system of innovation was so calcified, so strangled by bureaucracy and central planning, that they had become completely dependent on the West for their next technological leap. They were not innovators, they were mimics. And their entire system, from their spies to their engineers, was built around the assumption that the Western technology they stole was by default good. Weiss saw a judo move, a way to use the enemy's own massive, lumbering strength against him. He took his proposal directly to CIA Director William Casey and then to President Reagan. The idea was radical, subversive, and bordered on genius. Do not stop Line X, he argued. Help it. Do not deny the Soviets the technology they crave. Give it to them, but give them a version that is ever so slightly, indetectably, wrong. Reagan, a man who understood a dramatic strategy, loved it. He authorized one of the most sophisticated and devastating counterintelligence campaigns of the entire Cold War. The goal was no longer to plug the leaks. The goal was to poison the well. The American solution was born. It was an interagency phantom project, coordinated between the CIA, the Pentagon, and the Department of Commerce. It was a war fought not with soldiers, but with engineers. The ingenuity was in its patience. This was not about a quick, satisfying boom. It was about systemic, demoralizing, and expensive failure. The operation was breathtaking in its scope. American intelligence agencies and technology companies began a delicate, secret dance. When a known Line X agent, operating through a front company in Switzerland or Japan, put in an order for a specific type of high-powered microchip, the order would be quietly fulfilled. The chips would be manufactured by an American company, pass all quality assurance tests, and be shipped. And the Soviets would receive them triumphant. But these chips had a secret. They were cooked. They had been designed with a hidden flaw, a structural weakness that would cause them to fail not immediately, but after several hundred hours of operation. Or they would fail only when subjected to the specific vibrations of a tank tread or the low temperatures of the upper atmosphere. They were digital time bombs. When a Soviet design bureau sought to acquire the blueprints for a new, highly efficient American gas turbine, the kind needed for, say, a transcontinental pipeline, the plans would accidentally fall into their hands. The plans would be a marvel of engineering, and the Soviets would dutifully copy them down to the last bolt. But the American design had been subtly altered. The calculations for the turbine blade tolerances were off by a single critical decimal point. The blades, when manufactured by the Soviets, would look perfect. But under the immense stress and heat of operation, they would develop microfractures. They would vibrate, and, eventually, they would tear themselves apart. This was the source. This was the American project. It was the systemic, deliberate corruption of the entire technological pipeline. The bogeyman the Soviets were hunting in Part 2 was in fact an army of Trojan horses, all stamped with "Made in the USA" and gratefully stolen by the KGB itself. And then there was the pipeline. The hard currency pipeline was the #1 economic priority for the Soviet Union, and the Line X dossier confirmed they were desperate to steal the one thing they couldn't build: the sophisticated control software. They needed a complex automated system to manage the flow, the pressure, and the operations of thousands of miles of pipe. They targeted a Canadian software company, whose product was in turn based on American designs. According to Thomas Reed, a former Air Force secretary who served on the National Security Council, this was the operation's masterpiece. The CIA, working with the software engineers, allegedly created a special, corrupted version of the control software. It was a marvel of malicious code, a true logic bomb. This software was designed to be stolen. And when the KGB agents acquired it, they believed they had hit the jackpot. Their own experts examined the code. They ran it through every diagnostic test in their arsenal. And it passed. It passed perfectly. The software was installed, and it worked. For months, the genius of this American-designed malware was that it did not fail. It learned. It silently logged the normal operating parameters of the pipeline. It learned the rhythms of the pressure, the flow, the valves. And then, one day, in June 1982, it was programmed to depart from that baseline. It was designed to do exactly what Viktor Morozov, the terrified technician, had witnessed. It was designed to lie. It would tell the human operators that the pressure was normal, while simultaneously commanding the valves to close and the pumps to surge. It would block all manual override commands. It was designed to push the pipeline with precision to the absolute outer limits of its physical tolerance, and then one step beyond. The resulting 3-kiloton explosion was the non-nuclear shot heard around the world. It was the culmination of the American strategy. But the true ingenuity was not this single, spectacular explosion. The explosion was merely the exclamation point on a much longer, more devastating sentence. The true American dominance was in the realization that you could defeat a superpower without firing a shot. You could turn its own paranoia, its own secrecy, and its own systemic reliance on theft into the very instruments of its downfall. The Soviets were hunting ghosts, but the ghosts were real. They were the phantoms of flawed data, of corrupted code, and of cracked turbines. And the Soviets had invited them in, celebrated them as victories, and obediently copied them by the thousand, infecting their entire industrial and military body with a disease they could not see and would never understand. The investigation was a catastrophe. By 1984, the Special State Commission, the all-powerful Troika, was not just failing, it was actively making things worse. The purge of wreckers and saboteurs had gutted the Soviet Union's best technical institutes. The most brilliant engineers were either in prison or too terrified to do their jobs. The military's frantic efforts to build shields against imaginary beam weapons had diverted billions from desperately needed projects. And the plague raged on. The phantom radar tracks in the Arctic were now so common that PVO operators, out of sheer self-preservation, began to ignore them. They would log the impossible targets and then quietly go back to drinking their tea, leaving vast stretches of the northern border effectively undefended. New naval vessels, built with the latest Line X computer systems, suffered catastrophic electrical failures during their sea trials, sometimes crippling the ship for months. The national power grid was experiencing rolling blackouts, which the control systems insisted were not happening. The Soviet Union was a giant with a rotting nervous system. The Politburo, now led by the aged and ailing Konstantin Chernenko, demanded a final answer. The Troika, their own careers and perhaps their lives on the line, convened a secret, last-ditch meeting. They did not summon spies or generals. They summoned a man named Evgeny Velikov, a vice president of the Academy of Sciences. Velikov was a physicist, a man who dealt in facts, not ideology. He was famously brilliant and, for a Soviet academician, dangerously blunt. He had been quietly given access to the Commission's mountains of data, the failed components, the contradictory reports, the endless dead ends. The KGB deputy chairman, a man who had personally signed execution orders for saboteurs, began the meeting. "Academician," he said, his voice flat. "We are bleeding. Tell us who holds the knife." Velikov, a man with a thick shock of white hair, walked to a table in the center of the oak-paneled room. He carried a small wooden box. He did not look at the Troika, he looked at the box. "There is no knife," Velikov said, his voice quiet. The room was utterly silent. "The wound is self-inflicted." He opened the box and carefully placed two identical-looking objects on the green felt of the table. They were black, rectangular, and no bigger than a fingernail. Integrated circuits. "This chip," he said, pointing to the first, was recovered from the guidance system of a failed cruise missile at the Tula factory. It is a Type 133, a copy of the American Texas Instruments 7400 series. This, he pointed to the second, is the American original, acquired by Directorate T in 1979, a great intelligence victory. The GRU general leaned forward, his medals clinking softly. "What is your point?" Velikov produced a stack of large X-ray photographs. He laid them out, one by one. "My point, Comrade General, is that our engineers are the best in the world. They copied the American design perfectly. Every circuit, every pathway, an identical reproduction. We have spent 4 years arresting these men for their failures, but they did not fail. They succeeded." He tapped the last photograph. It showed a microscopic, almost invisible fracture in the silicon. "The American chip, the one we stole, has a flaw," Velikov said. "A Trojan horse, hidden deep inside. It is designed to function perfectly during all standard tests. But when subjected to the precise G-force of a missile launch, it cracks. Every single time." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "We copied the flaw. We copied it perfectly. We have installed this perfect copy in tens of thousands of our most advanced missiles. We arrested the men who built them when we should have given them a medal for their precision." This was the shock moment. It was not a thunderous explosion. It was a cold, silent, sickening realization. The blood drained from the KGB man's face. The enemy was not a beam weapon. The enemy was not a stealth bomber. The enemy was them. Their entire system of progress, their vaunted Line X, their heroic spies. It was all a giant, gaping vulnerability. Velikov wasn't finished. "The pipeline," he said, the name of the 1982 disaster hanging in the air. "The software was stolen from a Canadian firm. It passed every test. Because it was designed to pass every test. It was. A bomb. A bomb made of logic. The Americans didn't plant a bomb in Siberia. They tricked us into building it for them. The implications cascaded, filling the room with a dreadful, suffocating gravity. It was all a lie. The failing turbines, the phantom radar tracks, the faulty milling machines, the glitching power grids. It was all a setup. The West, led by the CIA, had not denied them technology. They had fed them poison. They had diagnosed the Soviet addiction to stolen tech, and had for years been patiently slipping them corrupted, flawed, and malicious designs. The purge, the paranoia, the wasted billions, the hunt for ghosts. This was not an accidental byproduct. This was the American weapon. The CIA hadn't just blown up a pipeline. It had successfully puppeteered the KGB into dismantling its own nation's scientific infrastructure. The paranoia was the payload. The investigation was the shrapnel. The room was silent for a full minute. The KGB man, a picture of cold fury, finally spoke. "How? How could we know?" he whispered. "How can we ever know?" And that was the real, inescapable, futile truth. They couldn't. The Commission's final, top-secret report to the Politburo was a document of pure despair. The only countermeasure they could propose was to create new institutes, new layers of bureaucracy, to test every single piece of acquired Western technology. It was a hopeless, impossible task. How do you test a chip for a flaw that only appears at 80,000 feet? How do you test a piece of software for a logic bomb that is programmed to detonate in 2 years? How do you test a metallurgical formula for a weakness that only manifests under a specific, secret operational stress? You can't. Not without the original American R&D data, and if they had that, they wouldn't need to steal the technology in the first place. This was the American checkmate. The Soviets were now trapped. They could not stop stealing Western tech, because their own domestic innovation was a hollowed-out shell. They had, for 2 generations, trained their best minds to be copycats, not inventors. But now, they could no longer trust the technology they stole. Every circuit, every blueprint, every line of code was a potential bomb. The entire foundation of their military and industrial power was now built on quicksand. Their futile response was to do the only thing they knew how: build more hardware. The PVO was still screaming for a counter to the ghosts, which they now horribly understood were inside their own radars. The answer was the MiG-31 Foxhound, the most advanced interceptor in the world. It was a masterpiece, built around the Zaslon radar, the first phased array system ever put in an aircraft. But the MiG-31 was a microcosm of the entire Soviet dilemma. To achieve its revolutionary performance, its designers had relied on hundreds of components, processors, and design concepts from Line X. The new interceptors rolled off the assembly line, astronomically expensive, and they were lemons. The advanced avionics were plagued by the same gremlins they were designed to hunt. Processors would overheat for no reason. The radar, a work of genius, would frequently glitch, seeing its own phantom targets. The pilots, just like the PVO operators before them, began to distrust their own machines. The Soviet Union had tried to build a new, better shield to defend itself, but the Americans had ensured it was built from the same poisoned sand. The shock was complete. It wasn't just that the CIA had tricked them, it was that they had no way to recover. The enemy was inside the gates, and the gates had been opened by their own hand. The final verdict on this invisible war was not written in a peace treaty, but in an accountant's ledger. The numbers, stripped of all ideology, told the story of a mortal blow. This is the killer statistic. In the early 1980s, the Soviet leadership was banking its entire economic future on the hard currency pipeline. It was projected to bring in over $20 billion a year by the middle of the decade. This was not profit. This was survival. It was the money they desperately needed to buy grain from the West to feed their people and to fund the arms race with the United Click States. The 1,982 pipeline explosion and the subsequent disease of failing turbines and corrupted compressors did not just halt this project. It created a cascading economic hemorrhage. The immediate cost of the Siberian blast alone was estimated in the hundreds of millions. But the real cost was measured in time. The project was crippled for years. By the time the Soviets had purged their systems and rebuilt the line, the entire geopolitical landscape had changed. The Reagan administration, in concert with Saudi Arabia, had flooded the world with cheap oil. By 1986, the price of a barrel of oil had plummeted from $35 to less than $10. The Soviet Union's one great cash machine was worthless. The $20 billion a year lifeline had vanished. The CIA's logic bomb had not just destroyed a pipeline, it had, in effect, bankrupted a superpower. Simultaneously, the farewell dossier was used to deliver the public blow. In 1983, the United States and its allies conducted a coordinated, worldwide expulsion of Soviet intelligence officers. In France, 47 diplomats and officials were declared persona non grata. In all, over 200 Line X agents, the cream of Directorate T's acquisition network, were identified and kicked out of the West. The network that had taken 20 years to build was shattered in a matter of weeks. The Soviets were now blind, poor, and trapped. Their primary source of new technology was gone, and their primary source of new money was gone. They were left with nothing but the poisoned fruit of their past victories, a military-industrial complex that was quietly eating itself alive from the inside. This campaign of technological sabotage was the macro theme of the Cold War made manifest. It was the final, brutal proof of a systemic failure, a judgment on two competing philosophies, imitation versus innovation. The Soviet system was a marvel of imitation. It was built on the ideological bedrock of a single central plan. The plan was sacred. It demanded predictability. It punished risk. It glorified replication. Why, a Soviet minister would argue, should the state waste $1 billion rubles and 10 years funding 5 competing research bureaus to invent a microchip, when Directorate T could steal a proven finished American design for a fraction of the cost? This was the Soviet shortcut. For decades, it seemed to work. They matched the American atomic bomb. They built a copy of the B-29 bomber. They stole computer technology, radar technology, and chemical processes. They built a superpower on a foundation of industrial espionage. But this shortcut had a hidden, terminal cost. It trained the best minds of a generation to be copycats, not creators. It stifled the very concept of innovation, which is, by its nature, messy, chaotic, and wasteful. It requires a dozen failures to produce one breakthrough. The Soviet system, terrified of failure and waste, had systematically hollowed out its own creative core. It was a brittle, sterile giant. The American system was the opposite. It was a chaotic, often duplicative, and seemingly inefficient ecosystem of competition. The government, through the Pentagon and NASA, would throw billions at a dozen different companies, all racing to solve the same problem. Bell Labs, IBM, Fairchild Semiconductor, and Texas Instruments were not cooperating. They were in a state of open, capitalist warfare. This chaos was the source of its strength. It was anti-fragile. It thrived on failure. For every successful SR-71, there were a dozen failed airframes rusting in the desert. For every revolutionary microchip, there were 1,000 dead-end designs. This constant high-pressure cooker of innovation was something the Soviets could not possibly replicate, because it was antithetical to their entire worldview. The genius of Gus Weiss and William Casey was that they recognized this. They saw that the Soviet strength, their peerless ability to steal, was in fact their single greatest vulnerability. The CIA didn't wage a war of technology. It waged a war of philosophy. It weaponized the very concept of innovation. The poison technology was the perfect, asymmetrical weapon. It was an attack that the Soviet system was structurally incapable of defending against. To find the flaw in the American chip, you needed to understand the entire ecosystem of R&D that produced it. You needed to have the original data, the failed test runs, the competing designs. The Soviets, holding only the final stolen product, were blind. The campaign forced the Soviet Union into a horrifying checkmate. They could no longer trust the technology they stole, but they could not stop stealing it, because they no longer knew how to invent it themselves. They were now paralyzed, forced to spend their last, dwindling resources retesting and re-verifying every single blueprint, every line of code, every processor, all while knowing they would never, ever be able to find all the ghosts. The Cold War did not end in 1991 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It ended in the mid-1980s, in secret, smoke-filled rooms in Moscow, with men like Evgeny Velikov staring at X-rays of a cracked microchip. It was in these moments that the Soviet leadership, the men of iron, truly understood their predicament. The mystery of the ghosts and the phantom planes was solved. The bogeyman had a face. And it was their own. The pipeline explosion of 1982 was more than an industrial disaster. It was a funeral pyre for the Soviet idea. It was the moment a war of invisible data and corrupted logic produced a 3-kiloton, real-world exclamation point. It was the physical manifestation of a systemic rot that had been festering for decades. The Americans had uncovered the central paradox of the Soviet Union, that a state built on a foundation of lies could be destroyed by a single, imported, technological truth. The corrupted software was, in a way, the most honest thing in the entire country. It was programmed to do one thing fail, and it did so perfectly. The legacy of the Farewell dossier is not just the explosion or the economic ruin. It is the profound psychological demolition of an empire. The KGB had been shocked to learn the CIA was corrupting their technology. But the final, fatal shock was the realization that their entire system had been a hollow shell, propped up by stolen dreams. And the Americans, in their final, brilliant and ruthless move, had simply kicked the props away. November 14th, 1979. A windowless briefing room deep within the grey, monolithic headquarters of the KGB's first chief directorate at Yasenevo, just outside Moscow. The air was thick with the scent of strong tobacco and stale tea, the only light coming from the green-tinged glow of a slide projector. Colonel Ivan Morozov, a man whose face seemed to be carved from the same granite as the building he occupied, tapped a wooden pointer against a grainy, black-and-white image projected on the wall. The image showed a line of gaunt, desperate-looking people snaking around a city block. It was a photograph from the American Great Depression, nearly 50 years old. But to the men in this room, it was not history. It was doctrine. It was truth. Morozov's voice was a low, gravelly hum, confident and absolute. "This," he declared, the pointer thumping the screen for emphasis, "is the fundamental, incurable sickness of capitalism. It is a system of artificial scarcity, of engineered poverty designed to discipline the masses. They have mountains of grain, yet their people starve. They produce cars by the million, yet their workers cannot afford them. This is the contradiction that will bring them to their knees." The young analysts in the room nodded in unison, their minds steeped in the unshakable certainty of Marxist-Leninist theory. They had spent their lives studying the inherent weaknesses of the West. They knew, with the certainty of religious faith, that the American system was a fragile house of cards, built on exploitation and destined for collapse. The official reports from their agents in the field confirmed it. They sent back detailed analyses of American labor strikes, of urban decay in cities like Detroit and New York, of racial tensions and political protests. Every piece of intelligence was carefully filtered through the lens of their ideology, reinforcing the narrative they already believed, that the Soviet Union, with its centrally planned economy and its commitment to the collective, was not just morally superior, but historically inevitable. The West was a glittering, decadent facade, rotting from within. The colonel advanced to the next slide. It was a table of agricultural statistics, showing Soviet grain yields steadily increasing, a testament to the success of collective farming. It was, of course, a complete fiction. Every man in that room knew the reality of Soviet agriculture. They knew about the disastrous harvests, the rotting potatoes left in the fields for lack of transport, the chronic shortages that defined daily life for 280 million Soviet citizens. They knew the truth because they lived it. Their own wives and mothers spent hours every day standing in queues, hoping for a meager ration of sausage or a few wrinkled onions. They were masters of the Blatt system, the intricate network of favors and connections required to obtain anything from a decent pair of shoes to a competent doctor. But in this room, under the unwavering gaze of the portrait of Yuri Andropov on the wall, the fiction was the only permissible reality. The lie was the state. To question it was not just heresy, it was treason. Then, a junior analyst, a bold young man named Viktor Orlov, cleared his throat. "Colonel," he began, his voice hesitant, "there is one report from the GRU's agricultural attaché in Washington. He speaks of something called a supermarket. He describes food availability that seems exaggerated." Morozov turned slowly, his eyes narrowing to slits. The projector hummed in the sudden, tense silence. An exaggerated report? It was a polite way of saying the agent was either a fool or a liar. Morozov had seen the report. It was fantastical, describing aisles of something called produce, with dozens of varieties of fruits and vegetables available year-round. It spoke of meat counters stretching for 50 meters, filled with every cut of beef, pork and chicken imaginable. It mentioned entire walls of refrigerated dairy, with countless types of milk, cheese and butter. It was absurd. It was decadent, bourgeois propaganda of the most obvious kind. Morozov raised a dismissive hand. The agent has clearly been compromised by Western disinformation, or perhaps he has spent too much time in the Langley cafeteria. We will have him recalled for re-education. There is no need to pollute our analysis with such fairy tales. The analysts shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak again. The fairy tale was dismissed. The briefing continued, reinforcing the comforting dogma of American decay. But for Viktor Orlov, a seed of an impossible question had been planted. What if the fairy tale was true? This dismissed report was a crack in the foundation of their entire worldview. It's the kind of hidden story we uncover every week here at Cold War Impact. Subscribe now so you don't miss the truth behind the secrets. The worldview that Colonel Morozov and his men defended so rigidly was not simply a matter of policy, it was the very architecture of their existence. The Soviet citizen was born into a world where the state was the sole provider, the ultimate arbiter of reality. From the cradle, they were taught that the centrally planned economy was the most advanced and humane system ever conceived. Capitalism, they learned, was chaotic, cruel, and wasteful. The anarchy of the market led to boom and bust cycles that threw millions out of work, while the greedy bourgeoisie hoarded the world's wealth. The official newspaper, Pravda, which ironically means truth, ran endless stories celebrating the triumphs of Soviet industry. Photographs showed smiling, heroic workers exceeding their quotas, vast fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, and gleaming new apartment blocks rising from the earth. The reality, of course, was a universe away from this glossy propaganda. The Soviet economy was a lumbering, inefficient behemoth, plagued by systemic flaws that were obvious to anyone who had to live within it. The central planners in Moscow, operating from the Gosplan headquarters, attempted to manage the economic output of a landmass spanning 11 time zones. They dictated the number of shoes to be produced in a factory in Minsk, the amount of steel to be smelted in Magnitogorsk, the number of tractors to be assembled in Volgograd. It was an impossible task, a futile attempt to replace the trillions of daily decisions of a market economy with the rigid decrees of a handful of bureaucrats. The result was a world of constant, surreal shortages and surpluses. A shoe factory might be ordered to produce 1 million shoes. To meet this simple numerical quota, the factory manager would produce 1 million shoes of the same size and for the same foot, creating a useless surplus while people went without footwear. A nail factory, given a quota based on weight, would produce a single enormous nail that was utterly useless. The entire system was geared toward meeting arbitrary targets on paper, with no regard for actual consumer need or demand. Food was the most critical and chronic failure. While Soviet propaganda boasted of bumper crops, the reality was one of perpetual struggle. Collective farming, which had destroyed the traditional, more productive peasant farming system, was notoriously inefficient. Even when a decent harvest was produced, a shocking percentage, some estimates say, up to 50% rotted before it could reach consumers, due to a catastrophic lack of storage facilities, refrigerated transport, and a functioning distribution network. The Soviet citizen's life was defined by the queue, the ochre. It was a daily ritual, a public display of the system's failure. People would line up for hours without even knowing what was being sold at the end of the line, simply on the rumor that a shipment of something, anything, had arrived. The empty shelves of the state-run gastronom stores were a national symbol. A common joke was a man walks into a fish store and asks, "You don't have any fish?" The clerk replies, "You've got the wrong store, comrade. This is the fish store where we don't have any fish. The store where they don't have any meat is across the street." This was the grim reality that Soviet intelligence agencies were tasked with both concealing from their own people and projecting onto their enemy. They were so immersed in their own world of scarcity and state control that they couldn't imagine anything different. They genuinely believed that the American system, stripped of its Hollywood gloss, must be even worse. They saw the West not as it was, but as their ideology insisted it had to be. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a completely different reality had taken root, born not from a grand central plan, but from a chaotic explosion of innovation, competition, and logistics. The American advantage in the Cold War was not just its fleet of B-52 seconds or its nuclear submarines. It was something far more fundamental, something the KGB analysts could never quantify: the astonishing efficiency of its system for producing and distributing the most basic necessity of human life, food. The genesis of this advantage began in the aftermath of World War II. While the Soviet Union was rebuilding its devastated agricultural sector, America was experiencing a revolution. The Green Revolution, spearheaded by scientists like Norman Borlaug, introduced high-yield crop varieties, advanced fertilizers, and modern irrigation techniques that sent agricultural productivity soaring to levels unprecedented in human history. American farms became the most productive on Earth, generating staggering surpluses of grain, corn, and soybeans. But producing the food was only half the battle. The true invisible miracle was the system that delivered it. The 1,950 seconds saw the construction of the interstate highway system, a logistical marvel that connected every corner of the country with high-speed, reliable transport. A head of lettuce grown in the fields of California could be loaded onto a refrigerated truck and be on a shelf in a New York store in 3 days, still fresh and crisp. And it was the destination of that truck that represented the ultimate symbol of this new reality: the supermarket. The American supermarket was not an invention of the state. It was the result of ferocious competition. Entrepreneurs like Clarence Saunders, with his Piggly Wiggly stores, had pioneered the concept of self-service, allowing customers to choose what they wanted directly from the shelves. This simple idea was revolutionary. It empowered the individual consumer, a concept that was complete anathema to the Soviet collective mindset. After the war, these stores exploded in number and scale. They were cathedrals of consumption, vast, brightly lit spaces designed for maximum choice and convenience. The psychological impact of this was immense. For Americans, abundance was normal. The idea of not being able to find bread, milk, or meat was unthinkable. Choice was a given. You didn't just buy cheese. You chose between cheddar, Swiss, provolone, mozzarella, and dozens of other varieties. You didn't just buy bread. You chose between white, wheat, rye, sourdough, and pumpernickel. This wasn't a secret policy or a hidden weapon. It was the mundane, everyday reality of American life. And it was precisely this mundanity that made it so incomprehensible to the Soviet mind. The KGB could understand a new spy plane. They could analyze the capabilities of a nuclear aircraft carrier. These were things that fit into their paradigm of state-on-state competition. What they couldn't understand, what they were ideologically blinded to, was the overwhelming power of a system that could effortlessly provide 20 different kinds of breakfast cereal to an average citizen in a small town in Ohio. They were looking for the enemy's tanks, never realizing that the most devastating weapon was hidden in plain sight, on aisle 7, right between the canned peaches and the potato chips. Boris Kirillovich Volkov was not a man given to fantasy. As a senior analyst in Directorate T, the KGB's scientific and technical intelligence branch, his entire career had been built on a foundation of cold, hard data. He dealt in blueprints, in telemetry intercepts, in stolen industrial processes. He had meticulously documented the West's technological achievements, but always framed them within the comforting context of dialectical materialism. To him, an American jet engine was a triumph of engineering, yes, but it was also a product of an exploitative military-industrial complex, an expensive bauble created on the backs of an oppressed proletariat. He was a true believer, not a cynical apparatchik. He had seen the poverty of his own nation, but accepted it as a necessary, temporary sacrifice on the long march toward a communist utopia. When he made the terrifying decision to defect in Vienna, handing himself over to a stunned CIA case officer, it was not because he had lost faith in the ideology. It was because he had been caught in the crosshairs of a vicious internal power struggle, a victim of a purge orchestrated by a rival. He chose defection over a shallow grave in the Lubyanka's cellars. He arrived at a quiet safe house in rural Virginia, a ghost still living in a Soviet world. He was guarded, arrogant, and dismissive of his American debriefers. He saw them as naive, their minds softened by comfort and bourgeois propaganda. In his first weeks of debriefing, he played the part of the superior intellectual. "You speak of freedom," he scoffed at his primary handler, a patient, unassuming man named Frank. "I have read your own government's reports on unemployment in your inner cities. I have seen the intelligence on your national debt. Your freedom is the freedom to starve. We may have temporary supply chain issues, but our system provides for everyone. No one is left behind." Frank would simply nod, making a note on his legal pad, never arguing. Boris took this as a sign of weakness, a tacit admission of the truth of his critique. He felt a smug satisfaction. He was teaching these cowboys the reality of the world. Frank mentioned they needed to go into town to pick up some supplies. Boris agreed, intrigued. He was eager to see the real America, to peel back the curtain and witness the decay he knew must be there. He expected to see a carefully curated Potemkin village, a show for his benefit. Perhaps they would take him to a special store for government elites, like the Berezka shops in Moscow, where high officials could spend foreign currency on Western goods. He steeled himself to see through the deception. As they drove down a wide, clean suburban road in a comfortable Ford sedan, Boris was silent, cataloguing the evidence for his preconceived notions. The houses were large, but he saw them as wasteful, individualistic boxes that lacked the collective spirit of Soviet apartment blocks. The cars were plentiful, but he knew they were bought on credit, chains of debt that enslaved the workers. It was all a facade, and he was the one man in this car smart enough to see it. Then Frank turned the car into a vast, sprawling parking lot. In front of them stood a long, low building with large glass windows. Above the entrance, a simple sign in red letters read, "Safeway." It looked ordinary, unassuming. There were no armed guards, no lines of weary people stretching around the block, just dozens of shoppers, dressed in casual clothes, moving in and out of the automatic doors with an air of utter nonchalance. Boris felt a prickle of confusion. This wasn't the elite government store he had expected. "This is it?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "This is where you shop?" Frank smiled. "Yep, this or the giant down the road. Come on, I need to get some steaks for the grill." Boris got out of the car, his senses on high alert, ready to spot the trick. He was still confident, still the KGB analyst searching for the hidden truth. The automatic doors hissed open, and Boris Kirillovich Volkov walked into a wall of light, color, and sound that shattered his universe. The first blow was the sheer, overwhelming scale of the place. The ceiling soared high above, lined with humming fluorescent lights that bathed everything in a clean, shadowless glare. Aisles, impossibly long and wide, stretched into the distance. So far he couldn't see the end of them. They were packed, from floor to ceiling, with a dizzying variety of goods. But it was the produce section, right near the entrance, that broke his mind. He just stopped, frozen, a few feet inside the door. Before him lay a mountain range of fruits and vegetables. He saw pyramids of gleaming red apples, next to pyramids of green ones. There were oranges, bananas, grapes, plums, strawberries even in the middle of autumn. He saw vegetables he couldn't name, strange, exotic shapes and colors from every corner of the world. Back in Moscow, a fresh tomato in winter was a luxury beyond the reach of all but the most powerful Politburo members. A banana was something a child might see once a year. Here, they were piled up like common stones, casually, almost carelessly abundant. He took a hesitant step forward and saw a fine mist spray over a bed of leafy greens, lettuce, spinach, kale, dozens of types, all of it crisp and vividly alive. He had never seen such a thing. In his world, vegetables were limp, dirt-caked things, if you could find them at all. He was stunned. He literally couldn't believe what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a stage, an elaborate theatrical production built just for him. Frank, noticing his silence, walked over. "You okay, Boris?" Boris didn't answer. He turned, his eyes wide, and looked past the produce to the meat counter. It was a river of red and white under a pane of gleaming glass. It stretched on, filled with every cut of beef, pork, lamb and chicken. There were rows of sausages, piles of ground meat, thick-cut steaks. The sheer quantity was horrifying. He thought of the endless queues in Moscow, the grimy butcher shops with their perpetually empty hooks, the greasy, bone-filled cuts of meat that were considered a triumph to bring home. The sight before him wasn't just abundance. It was a physical insult to the suffering and sacrifice of his people. He felt a wave of dizziness. He turned again, his gaze sweeping across the rest of the store. An entire aisle, one whole aisle, dedicated to nothing but bread. Another for milk and cheese, the refrigerated shelves humming with a quiet power, holding more dairy than he had seen in his entire life combined. And then he saw the cereal aisle. It was a kaleidoscope of color, a wall of brightly printed cardboard boxes, each bearing a different cartoon character, a different promise of sugary delight. He stared at it, baffled. Why would any society need this many different kinds of breakfast cereal? The sheer, pointless, glorious variety of it all was a form of power he had never conceived of. It wasn't the power of a tank division or a missile silo. It was the power of a system that could produce this much of everything, so effortlessly that it could afford to be frivolous. It was in that moment, standing between the Cheerios and the Frosted Flakes, that the dam inside Boris Kirillovich Volkov finally broke. The confident KGB colonel, the master of data and doctrine, the true believer in the historical inevitability of communism, began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified tearing up. He choked on a sob, a raw, guttural sound of pure anguish. He covered his face with his hands as silent, hot tears streamed down his cheeks. He wept for his entire life, a life spent in service to a monstrous, inefficient lie. He wept for his wife, who would be standing in a queue right now, hoping for a few withered potatoes. He wept for his son, who would never know this reality. He wept for the 280 million people of the Soviet Union, toiling and starving for a dream that this ordinary grocery store proved was a hollow, pathetic joke. He was not just shocked, he was spiritually broken. All the intelligence reports, all the theoretical models, all the years of indoctrination vaporized in the face of this simple, overwhelming truth. The West wasn't rotting. The West wasn't decadent and weak. The West was a force of nature, a logistical miracle so vast and powerful that it could create this temple of abundance and treat it as something utterly ordinary. Frank gently put a hand on his shoulder. "Boris?" he asked softly. Boris lowered his hands, his face pale, his eyes red and lost. He looked at Frank, his expression one of complete, utter defeat. He pointed a trembling finger at a stack of oranges. Is it all real?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Frank looked at him with a sad, knowing expression. "Yes, Boris," he said. "It's all real. And it's not even a particularly big one." The breakdown of Boris Volkov in the Safeway was not an isolated incident. To his handler, Frank, it was a tragically familiar scene. Over the years, the CIA had developed an unofficial but highly effective psychological tool, a kind of litmus test for the souls of men escaping the Soviet bloc. They called it, informally, the supermarket tour. They had discovered, through trial and error, that nothing shattered the ideological conditioning of a lifetime more effectively than a casual stroll down the aisles of an average American grocery store. It was more powerful than lectures on democracy, more convincing than stacks of economic data, and more devastating than showing them classified intelligence on their own system's failures. The supermarket was the truth made manifest. A defector could rationalize a B-1 bomber as a tool of aggression or a skyscraper as a monument to capitalist ego. But they could not rationalize a wall of 50 different kinds of mustard. They couldn't explain away the casual, thoughtless abundance available to any random person with a few dollars in their pocket. This experience became a systematic part of the defector resettlement program. It was the first crucial step in deprogramming a mind that had been confined in a cage of scarcity and lies. The new reality Boris had collided with wasn't a secret weapon. It was the entire system operating in plain sight. The American food system of the Cold War era was a sprawling, decentralized, and brutally efficient organism. It was a network of millions of independent farmers, thousands of competing trucking companies, hundreds of regional distributors, and tens of thousands of retail outlets, all operating without a central plan from Washington. This anarchy of the market, which Soviet theorists so confidently derided, was in fact a highly sophisticated information processing system. A spike in demand for avocados in Chicago would instantly send price signals back to growers in California, who would adjust their planting and shipping schedules accordingly. It was a daily, silent miracle of logistics that Soviet planners, with all their supercomputers and legions of bureaucrats, could never hope to replicate. Gosplan could order the production of 10 million tins of canned peas, but it couldn't ensure the cans, the labels, the transport, or the consumer desire would all align. The American supermarket, by contrast, was the endpoint of a system that was self-correcting, ruthlessly competitive, and entirely focused on a single goal, giving the consumer exactly what they wanted, when they wanted it. This wasn't a rare showcase. There were over 30,000 such supermarkets across the United States by the 1,970 seconds. From the blazing deserts of Arizona to the frozen coast of Maine, this same reality of overwhelming abundance was the unquestioned norm. The KGB was baffled. Their agents sent back reports, but the leadership couldn't comprehend the scale. They assumed the stores must be elaborate fakes or only located in wealthy areas. They never knew that the same overflowing shelves could be found next to a steel mill in Pittsburgh or a cotton field in Alabama. They were so used to their own system of privileges, special stores for the party elite, for scientists, for the military, that they couldn't grasp the democratic nature of American abundance. This shockwave was not limited to high-level KGB defectors. It struck every level of Soviet society that happened to brush against the West. Consider the case of Nikolai Petrov, a fictional but representative composite of Soviet merchant sailors of the era. A third mate on a Soviet fishing trawler, Nikolai's world was the cramped, rusty confines of his ship and the grey, crumbling port cities of the USSR. In 1982, his ship docked in Baltimore for emergency repairs. The crew was given a supervised 6-hour shore leave. To them, it was like visiting another planet. Their political officer, the Zampolit, gave them a stern lecture before they disembarked. Comrades, do not be fooled by the superficial glitter of the West. Remember the homeless, the unemployed. This is a society of deep inequality. Nikolai and his friends, clutching the few dollars they were allowed to exchange, walked into the city. They were stunned by the sheer number of cars, by the cleanliness of the streets, by the clothes people wore. But their Zampolit's words echoed in their ears, a shield against the cognitive dissonance. Then, seeking a gift for his daughter, Nikolai was guided by a helpful port worker to a simple drugstore. It was not a supermarket, not a grand department store. Just a common Rite Aid. Nikolai walked in and was immediately paralyzed. He saw an entire aisle of brightly colored toys. He saw shelves groaning with different kinds of soap, shampoo, and toothpaste products that were chronically short in the Soviet Union. But it was a simple bin of fruit near the checkout counter that stopped his heart. It was filled with oranges. Oranges were a treasure, a rare treat that appeared in Soviet stores maybe once a year, around New Year's, commanding enormous queues. Here, they were piled high, each one a perfect, unblemished sphere of impossible color. He saw a woman nonchalantly pick up half a dozen and toss them in her basket as if they were pebbles. The price was so low he thought it had to be a mistake. He bought 2, holding them in his hands like precious jewels. He then saw the candy aisle, hundreds of different chocolate bars, chewing gums, and sweets. He had never imagined such variety could exist. He spent the rest of his money on a bag of Hershey's Kisses for his daughter and a pack of Wrigley's gum for his wife. When he got back to the ship, he showed his purchases to his crewmates. They gathered around, their eyes wide with disbelief. They passed around the chocolate, each man taking one, unwrapping the small piece of foil with the reverence of a religious ritual. The Zampolit stormed over, his face purple with rage. "Bourgeois poison," he spat. "Trinkets designed to rot your teeth and your soul." But his words were hollow. The evidence was right there, melting in their mouths. For the rest of the voyage, the men were silent, contemplative. The taste of that simple, mass-produced chocolate was the taste of a different reality, a world where such small pleasures weren't a once-in-a-decade luxury, but a trivial, everyday commodity. Nikolai never knew the full picture, but he knew one thing for certain. The system that could produce that orange and that piece of chocolate so effortlessly was not a system on the verge of collapse. The most profound shock, however, was reserved for those who were supposed to be the masters of the Soviet system itself. In the late 1972, as part of a détente-era agricultural exchange, a delegation of high-ranking Soviet agronomists and Gosplan officials was given a tour of a typical family farm in Iowa. These were not naive sailors, they were the architects of Soviet agricultural policy. They arrived full of condescending confidence, ready to lecture the American farmer on the scientific principles of socialism. What they saw horrified them. The farm was a vast, sprawling enterprise of thousands of acres, run by a single family with the help of a few hired hands. The farmer, a man in a John Deere cap, showed them his machinery. He had enormous, air-conditioned combines that could harvest 100 acres of corn in a single day. He had computerized irrigation systems and used satellite data to analyze soil composition. The Soviet officials, who were accustomed to collective farms where thousands of peasants worked with outdated, constantly braking tractors, were speechless. They couldn't believe one family could manage such an operation. Then the farmer took them to his grain silos. They were colossal metal structures, holding more grain than an entire Soviet district might produce. "This is just my buffer," the farmer explained casually. "To play the market. The real stuff goes straight to the co-op." The visitors were baffled. They looked at each other, their faces pale. Their country was forced to import millions of tons of grain from the West every year just to avoid mass starvation. And here one man, on his own, had a personal surplus that could feed a small city. The final blow came when the farmer's wife invited them in for lunch. She laid out a spread of fried chicken, corn on the cob, fresh bread, and apple pie. It was a simple, hearty meal. One of the Soviet officials, through a translator, asked the woman how long she had to stand in line to get the ingredients. She looked at him with a completely blank, uncomprehending expression. "Line?" she asked. "I just went to the store and bought it." The translator struggled to explain the concept of the queue, of shortages, of the daily hunt for basic foodstuffs. The more he explained, the more confused and vaguely pitying the woman's expression became. The delegation ate their lunch in a stunned, funereal silence. They had come to America to see the failures of capitalism. Instead, they had witnessed a system of production so powerful, so mind-bogglingly efficient, that their own 5-year plans and collective farms were exposed as a pathetic, primitive farce. The recurring symbol of this new, terrifying reality was not a weapon or a flag, it was the shopping cart, the telezhka. In the Soviet Union, the iconic symbol of the shopper was the avoska, a collapsible string bag carried in a pocket or purse. The name itself came from the Russian word avos, meaning just in case or hopefully. The avoska was a symbol of a life built on chance and scarcity. You carried it with you at all times, on the off chance you happened to walk by a store just as a shipment of sausage or cheese arrived. It was a tool of hope against a backdrop of systemic failure. The American shopping cart was its ideological opposite. It was enormous, sturdy, and, most importantly, empty. It was not a tool of hope. It was a vessel of expectation. You took a cart at the entrance not just in case, but with the absolute, unquestioned certainty that you would find enough to fill it. The sight of an ordinary American, a housewife, a factory worker, a student pushing a cart piled high with a colorful mountain of food, was, to the Soviet eye, the ultimate display of power. It was a quiet, mundane parade of victory that happened 1,000,000 times a day in every town and city across the nation. This was the shock that became the norm. It wasn't a single event. It was a relentless, grinding pressure. A constant, silent broadcast of a reality that proved the entire Soviet experiment had failed. The Cold War, they were beginning to realize, was not being fought on the battlefields of Europe or in the skies over the Arctic. It was being won, decisively and irrevocably, in Aisle 5. The reports from agents like the one Viktor Orlov had seen, and the debriefings of men like Boris Volkov, did not simply vanish into the archives. They trickled upwards, slowly, reluctantly, through the vast, sclerotic bureaucracy of the Soviet state, until they landed with a thud on the polished desks of the men who ruled a sixth of the world's landmass. Inside the Kremlin, behind the thick, soundproofed walls of the Politburo's meeting room, a quiet, existential panic began to take hold. At first, the reaction was disbelief, followed by rage. The initial instinct of leaders like Leonid Brezhnev and Yuri Andropov was to shoot the messenger. The intelligence was dismissed as Western provocation, as evidence of compromised agents, or as simple, decadent exaggeration. They were horrified. They were men who had dedicated their lives to an ideology that promised historical victory, and they were now being told that the enemy was winning the Cold War not with missiles, but with milk and bread. In a secret 1981 session, a transcript of which was later found in the Central Committee archives, KGB Chairman Andropov presented a consolidated report on Western consumer goods production. He spoke in his typical cold, clinical monotone, but the words themselves were incendiary. He described the logistical efficiency of American food distribution, the sheer variety of products, and the price stability. He concluded, "Comrades, we have been underestimating the ideological danger of their so-called consumer society. Our people are being exposed to a level of material comfort that we cannot currently match. This gap is becoming a significant national security vulnerability." The room was heavy with a stunned silence. To admit this was to admit a fundamental failure of their entire 70-year experiment. Their system was supposed to be superior. It was supposed to provide for the worker, to eliminate the waste and inequality of capitalism. And yet, the ultimate symbol of that system's failure was the empty Soviet shopping bag, the Avoska. The party's first reaction was not to reform, but to double down on the lie. They launched a new wave of internal propaganda. The West's abundance was portrayed as a moral sickness. Documentaries shown on state television depicted Americans as obese, decadent, and spiritually empty, slaves to their material possessions. The food itself was attacked. American bread was full of chemicals. Their chickens were pumped with hormones. Their fruit was unnaturally perfect and tasteless. It was a desperate attempt to turn a crushing material defeat into a supposed moral victory. The Soviet citizen, with his simple, wholesome black bread and cabbage, was portrayed as spiritually superior to the confused American consumer, lost in a maze of pointless choices. But this propaganda was becoming increasingly ineffective. Too many people now had a brother, a cousin, a friend who had traveled abroad as a sailor, a diplomat, or an athlete. They had heard the stories. They had seen the forbidden photographs. They had tasted the contraband chocolate. The lie was becoming too difficult to sustain. Faced with a reality they could no longer deny, the Politburo did the only thing it knew how to do. It created a grand, centrally planned solution to the problems of central planning. In May 1982, Brezhnev announced the Food Program, a massive top-down initiative to finally solve the nation's chronic agricultural failures. It was the ultimate expression of Soviet thinking. They allocated an astronomical sum, 160 billion rubles, nearly a third of the entire national budget, to be invested in agriculture over the next decade. The program called for the creation of vast agro-industrial complexes, for the production of more tractors and fertilizer, for ambitious land improvement and irrigation projects. It was a brute force attack on the problem, an attempt to bury it under a mountain of rubles and steel. On paper, it was the most ambitious agricultural plan in human history. In practice, it was a colossal failure. The program was doomed from the start because it treated the symptoms of the disease, not the cause. The problem wasn't a lack of tractors, it was that the collective farm system gave farmers no incentive to use them effectively. Why work harder when your salary was fixed? and any surplus you produced was simply confiscated by the state. The problem wasn't a lack of fertilizer. It was that the fertilizer often arrived at the wrong time of year, or was the wrong chemical composition, because the planners in Moscow had no connection to the realities of the soil in Uzbekistan or Ukraine. The new agro-industrial complexes became monuments to the system's absurdity. Gleaming, state-of-the-art meat processing plants were built, but they stood idle for half the year because the chronically inefficient livestock sector couldn't provide enough animals to keep them running. Massive new grain elevators were constructed, but the decrepit rural road network meant the grain couldn't get to them before it rotted in the fields. The food program poured concrete and steel onto a system that was dying from a spiritual sickness, a complete lack of individual incentive and market signals. While a single American farmer in Iowa was adjusting his output based on real-time commodity prices from the Chicago Board of Trade, the Soviet planner was trying to manage a continent's food supply using decade-old data and rigid, 5-year quotas. They were trying to fly a supersonic jet by reading a steam engine manual. The futile nature of these countermeasures was obvious to anyone who had to live with the results. The shelves in the gastronomes remained as empty as ever, the queues grew longer. The only tangible result of the food program was a new genre of bitter jokes. What is the result of the food program? The TV is now full of food, but the refrigerator is still empty. This glaring disconnect between the state's promises and the citizens' reality had a devastating psychological impact. It bred a deep, corrosive cynicism that rotted the foundations of the regime's legitimacy. People simply stopped believing anything the government said. The official ideology became a hollow ritual, a set of phrases to be repeated in public while being mocked in private. And into this vacuum of belief flooded the symbols of the very system they were supposed to despise. Western consumer goods became the ultimate status symbols. A pair of Levi's jeans, smuggled into the country and sold on the black market for a month's salary, was not just a piece of clothing, it was a political statement. It was a rejection of the shapeless, poorly made products of Soviet light industry and an embrace of Western quality, style and individualism. A Beatles record, copied from a copy of a copy until it was barely audible, was a window into a world of creative freedom that was unimaginable in the tightly controlled Soviet cultural sphere. Even the plastic shopping bag from a Western supermarket became an icon. A brightly coloured bag with Safeway or Tesco printed on it would be carefully washed, folded, and reused for months, carried like a designer handbag. It was a small, everyday act of defiance, a quiet declaration that you were connected, however tenuously, to that other world, the world of abundance. For the KGB agents and diplomats stationed in the West, this psychological corrosion was even more acute. Their job was to wage war against a system whose material superiority was an undeniable, daily presence in their lives. They would spend their days writing reports about the inherent contradictions of capitalism, and then spend their evenings watching their children fall in love with American cartoons and crave American breakfast cereal. They were the frontline soldiers in an ideological war that they secretly knew their side was losing. They saw the full shelves, the effortless logistics, the sheer, overwhelming normalcy of Western prosperity. This cognitive dissonance was a crushing burden. It led to alcoholism, depression, and for a significant number, the ultimate act of treason, defection. Men like Boris Volkov were not anomalies. They were the logical endpoint of a system that forced its most intelligent and observant servants to live a lie. They were tasked with defending a fantasy, and the daily, mundane reality of a grocery store was enough to make them break. The unraveling was not happening in the missile silos or the tank factories. It was happening in the minds of the Soviet people and its own elite. They were fighting a war for the future while living in a present that was manifestly inferior. The Kremlin's response, more propaganda, more investment in a failed system, was like trying to patch a hole in a dam with newspaper. They could see the cracks spreading, they could hear the structure groaning, but they were ideologically incapable of doing the one thing that might have saved them, admitting that their entire blueprint for reality was wrong. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse is not simply a story of failed economics, it is a story of a failed moral and philosophical proposition. The supermarket was not merely a building full of food, it was the final, irrefutable verdict in the 70-year trial of two opposing ideas. The core promise of communism was the creation of a new Soviet man, a selfless individual who would subordinate his own needs and desires to the greater good of the collective. The state, guided by the infallible party, would provide all that was necessary. This system demanded faith. It demanded that the citizen believe in the promise of a future utopia, even as their present reality was one of grey conformity and grinding scarcity. The American system, by contrast, was built on a foundation that was, to the Marxist mind, contemptibly individualistic. It made no grand promises of a future utopia. Instead, it offered the individual an almost infinite array of small, immediate choices: which car to drive, which movie to see, which brand of soap to buy. The supermarket was the ultimate temple of this philosophy. It was a cathedral built to the sovereignty of the individual consumer. The choice between 20 different kinds of breakfast cereal, which had so baffled Boris Volkov, was not a sign of frivolous waste. It was a daily, tangible expression of freedom. It was the product of a system that trusted its people to make their own decisions, a system that harnessed the chaotic, creative power of millions of individual ambitions, rather than trying to suppress them in favor of a single, monolithic state plan. The Cold War, therefore, was won not just by America's industrial might in building aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, but by its far more complex and profound ability to orchestrate a logistical symphony that could deliver a ripe tomato to a kitchen in Minnesota in the middle of January. This was the true demonstration of a superior system. The Soviet Union could concentrate immense resources to achieve singular, monumental goals, sending a man to space, building the world's largest nuclear bomb. But it was utterly incapable of solving the far more complex equation of feeding its own people with dignity and variety. The planned economy was a sledgehammer in a world that required a surgeon's scalpel. It was a blunt instrument of brute force, while the market economy was an infinitely adaptable, self-correcting organism. This was the final, crushing realization for the Soviet leadership. They had built a military to rival the world, but they had built a society that could not compete with a single, well-stocked grocery store. Their system had created the Avoska, the string bag of desperate hope. The American system had created the shopping cart, the vessel of confident expectation. The moral and industrial victory was complete. The ultimate demonstration of this truth did not come from a defector's debriefing, but from the stunned confession of a man who would soon preside over the Soviet Empire's dissolution. In September of 1989, just 2 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, a rising political star named Boris Yeltsin, then a member of the Supreme Soviet, made his first visit to the United States. During a stop in Houston, Texas, his hosts, as part of the tour, took him to a mid-sized, ordinary grocery store, a Randall's supermarket. What happened next was a historical echo of Boris Volkov's personal trauma, but played out on the world stage. Yeltsin, a man who came from the absolute pinnacle of the Soviet elite, walked into the store and was visibly shattered. He wandered the aisles in a daze, his face a mask of disbelief. He stared at the meat counter, at the endless varieties of cheese, at the colourful displays of fresh produce. He stopped at the frozen food aisle and was shown a display of Jell-O pudding pops. He spoke with the store manager about inventory and pricing. He asked customers about what they were buying and if they had to wait in line. The answers he received, confirming this effortless abundance, left him speechless. Later, on his plane, Yeltsin was grim and withdrawn. He confessed to his companions what the experience had done to him. The official record and his own autobiography document his words. He said, "For a long time on the plane to Miami, I sat motionless, my head in my hands. What have they done to our poor people?" He later wrote that the visit to the Randall's supermarket was the moment that crushed him. He wrote that if the Soviet people, who were then suffering under a rationing system for basics like sugar and soap, could see the reality of a grocery store like this, there would be a revolution. This was not a low-level analyst or a disillusioned sailor. This was a man at the heart of the Soviet power structure, a man who was supposed to be a true believer, admitting complete and utter defeat. He understood in that moment that the glowing production reports from Gosplan were a lie. He understood that the propaganda about the rotting West was a fantasy. He understood that his entire country was a Potemkin village, and that the real superpower was the one that could fill 1 million shopping carts without a second thought. 2 months later, the Berlin Wall fell. It was not pushed down by an invading army of tanks. It was chipped away, dismantled, and finally breached by ordinary people who were no longer willing to live the lie. They were drawn by the irresistible gravity of the world they saw on their forbidden West German television channels, a world of freedom, a world of opportunity, a world symbolized by the overflowing shelves of the Kardowy department store. The ultimate weapon of the Cold War, turned out to be the quiet, relentless broadcast of a better reality. When the first East Germans flooded into the West, they did not rush to government buildings or military bases. They rushed to the stores, their eyes wide, with the same childlike wonder that Boris Volkov and Boris Yeltsin had experienced. They stood in front of fruit stands, weeping at the sight of bananas. They were stunned. They were baffled. They couldn't believe it was all real. In the end, the Soviet Union was not conquered from without, but hollowed out from within. It was defeated by a truth so simple and so powerful that no amount of propaganda could conceal it forever. The confident pronouncements of Colonel Morozov in his windowless briefing room, his grainy slides showing a sick and dying America, were revealed to be nothing more than the desperate incantations of a dying faith. The system built on the promise of collective triumph produced only shared misery. The system built on the foundation of individual choice produced a level of prosperity that its rival could only dream of. The Cold War was a long, twilight struggle fought with spies, soldiers, and scientists. But the final, decisive battle was waged in the bright, clean, fluorescent-lit aisles of a supermarket. It was a battle of ideas, and the evidence of the victor was stacked high, in glorious, overwhelming abundance. The laughter of the German pilots who first saw the P-47 Thunderbolt was the laughter of arrogance, an ignorance that was soon corrected by overwhelming firepower. The laughter of the Soviet theorists who derided the anarchy of the market was the laughter of an ideology that had blinded itself to reality, an ignorance that was ultimately corrected by the simple, devastating truth of an empty shelf versus a full one. The thunder had spoken, but this time its voice was the humble, incessant beep of a cash register, ringing up a victory that changed the world.